Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, Liz. That was really maybe the nicest introductions anybody's ever given me. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you all very much. It's a huge responsibility to open for such a distinguished roster of speakers at this occasion. I really want to congratulate Peter and Liz, the organizers of the exhibition and the conference, and certainly to thank you both for asking me to speak here today. Yesterday, I was really struck. There are so many people here with so much erudition about so many aspects of Lawrence Alma-Tadema's career and its Victorian context. I've already learned a great deal. I look forward to learning more. I'm a little intimidated about what I might have to offer, so here goes. But I thought when they asked me to start the proceedings, maybe the thing to do was to raise some broad and provocative questions about the legacy of the artists Lawrence Alma-Tadema and Frederick Leighton, who've been brought together in their extraordinary houses in the exhibition and the events that are associated with the exhibition today. And I do, as Liz suggested, approach this topic from what might be described as enemy territory. But then again, here you are in Bloomsbury, so you came to me. And as Liz suggested, I have worked a lot on the famous, or perhaps from the Victorian perspective, notorious Bloomsbury group, which a century ago, let's see, oh, here's the slide. Is this the advancer? Oh, I can just use the down thing there. Okay, there we go. There they are. So a century ago, they were busy right here in this neighborhood. As you can see, that's Fitzroy Square, I'm sure people know, and the color image that's on the right is the sketch for the panel that was set into the facade of the house that's still in Fitzroy Square, a very blue plaque there today. George Bernard Shaw, who lived in that square, wrote a letter complaining that it defaced the entire square to have this modernist expression on the outside of the buildings. So there they were, forming the form of modernism that was premised on opposition to Victorians such as Leighton and Alma-Tadema. Thus it was, to take just one horrifying Bloomsbury anecdote, I feel like I should tell people you're allowed to boo and hiss when I read the quotations. Picture this in Christmas time, 1912. Vanessa Bell had stayed here in London, recuperating from illness while her husband had taken the children to his parents in the countryside. And so she wrote to him about a day when she was visited by her friend, the painter Duncan Grant, and she describes the visit in a letter to her husband, and this is the quotation. Duncan lay on the floor and talked in a desultory but cheering way of how we are to turn my studio into a tropical forest with great red figures on the walls, a blue ceiling with birds of paradise floating from it, my idea, and curtains, each one different. And what I'm showing you here is a room that was then in the Omega Workshops, which was a recreation of a room that she did a few months later as a nursery for her own children. There are birds of paradise stuck on the ceiling. You can see a wing of one kind of sticking down there. So I just put this image to kind of give us a visualization of her remarks, which continue. So after she says curtains, each one different, she says, "This is all to cheer us through London winters. Duncan also wants a bath let into the floor, but I told him that was a la Leighton House, which made him rather cross." All right, the story encapsulates something problematic in the Bloomsbury Group's self-understanding. I think from our perception just over a century later, it's easy to see how much Bloomsbury's extravagant domestic interiors had in common with those of their Victorian forerunners. But Bloomsbury, of course, did not see that. They saw the Victorian academic painters like Leighton as what they were reacting against. And now here I'm going to evoke another horrifying story for this crowd. This one about Roger Fry, who with Bell and Grant, of course, was the co-organizer of the Omega Workshops. And the text dates from almost exactly the same period as it appeared just a few weeks after the conversation that Bell and Grant just had. This one appeared in public in The Nation magazine in one of the issues from January 1913. And it displays the same prejudices as the conversation we just heard. Here, Fry, fresh from his debates over the second post-impressionist exhibition, goaded the art establishment with a rumination about a retrospective exhibition dedicated to the recently deceased Lawrence Alma-Tadema. This is where you can boo. Fry says, his art demands nothing from the spectator beyond the almost unavoidable knowledge that there was such a thing as the Roman Empire, whose people were very rich, very luxurious, and in retrospect, at least, agreeably wicked. Not that he ever makes them real people. He does, however, add the information that all of the people of that interesting and remote period, all their furniture, clothes, even their splendid marble divans, were made of highly scented soap, end quote. I chose this visual example because I do think it does illustrate Fry's jibe pretty well, but also because of a certain compositional and thematic similarity. People on benches engaged in leisurely delectation allows me to return to my theme of similarities between Bloomsbury and its Victorian forerunners. And that would be between Alma-Tadema's title, Under the Roof of the Blue Ionian Weather, and Bell's remark about her imagined, quote-unquote, blue ceiling with birds of paradise floating from it to cheer us through London winters. Again, my idea is that we can see points of connection that were lost to Bloomsbury and likely would have been lost on Leighton and Alma-Tadema too if they'd stuck around to comment. So these connections link not only the paintings, of course, but also the artist's domestic spaces. Indeed, the fact that Leighton and Alma-Tadema and the Bloomsbury artists conceived and publicized these semi-public domestic spaces as part of their artistic practice is an important connection in itself. This shared interest beyond the artist's own domestic spaces, however, includes the design of decorative furniture, as you see here, the design and production of textiles. Here are some of Bell's curtains that she imagined in that conversation earlier, curtains of sort of all different colors and patched fabrics. Let's see, I have curtains, I have something else. Oh, that's right, musical instruments. How could I forget the musical instruments, Clark people? So there are lots of kinds of similarities to look at among these artists. Beyond these broad connections, of course, there's a shared interest in particular historical references. I'm thinking in particular, all of these artists were interested in Byzantium, and we see that play out, of course, in the decorations at Leighton House, as well as in Alma-Tadema's art, and also in if you look at what was hung on the wall at the Omega workshops, amazingly, it's these reproductions of mosaics from Ravenna. It plays out in paintings by Duncan Grant and Vanessa Bell. These are pictures from my Bloomsbury Rooms book, little plug there. As well, of course, as in their decorative work. People probably know the big mural that was made by Duncan Grant for the Borough Polytechnic School, which was described by a critic at the time who said, "It makes one want to swim even in waters of an early Christian mosaic." So that idea of kind of invoking the Byzantine in a modernist way. And of course, it plays out in the commissions of the Omega workshop. So I'm thinking of these kind of giant buckets of flowers on the wall in this extraordinary room from 1914. And again, going back to the sort of mosaics that I showed you in the first slide from Ravenna. In none of these cases is archaeological accuracy really the point. As Liz just suggested, there's a kind of updating of these invocations from the past as a way to imagine modern sensibilities grounded in opportunities for mobility, both mobility in person as people traveled to these exotic places, and of course through the circulation and citation of images, like we saw those reproductions on the wall at the Omega. And then, of course, connecting these artists are their houses. The Leighton, Alma-Tadema, and the Bloomsbury artists all had these houses and gardens, extraordinary sites of collection and display that spill out into nature to kind of blend the fecundity of the natural site with the classical statuary. You can just see the classical heads in the garden at Charleston down in Sussex in the slide that's there on the right. Not to mention, oh, and so this idea of kind of creating these spaces of creativity inside and out, where the garden kind of blends with the inside spaces, and just this kind of miracle of creativity and natural abundance, and of course the love of costume drama that again would be a kind of connection among these artists who probably wouldn't have seen that connection themselves, but it all looks very clear to us. One might fairly ask then why, in light of all of these connections for Vanessa Bell, why were birds of paradise painted on a tropical blue ceiling delightfully modern, but a sunken tub out of the question? And why was her description of out of the question phrased as a la Leighton House, and why did that make Duncan Grant rather cross? I do recognize that there are some differences between the image that you see on the left and the image that you see on the right here. But what I want to do at this point is look at writings from the period and try to get at what values were at stake in these competing aesthetics. And to do that, I'm afraid I'm going to have to adduce my last mean remark about Alma-Tadema. This one comes from Walter Sickert, who was positioned chronologically and ideologically between the late Victorians and the post-impressionists. And Sickert anticipated something of Fry's critique when, in a review of the Academy exhibition of 1890, he complained about this portrait, that essentially it presents an artificial surface instead of a three-dimensional figure. And he complains that the nose and the ear are on the same plane in this picture. And then he goes on to say about the artist, quote, "All he does is to give us a highly polished map of the surface of the sitter's skin. That this should be so, I suppose, is the logical consequence of a lifetime spent in compiling pictures of Roman life from every document except the essential one, namely personal observation," end quote. Here I am interested that Sickert's complaint, like Fry's, circles around something that they both see as meretricious in the surface. The surfaces of the paintings, the surfaces of the things represented, that render them like scented soap or like polished maps instead of, well, and that's the question, sort of instead of what? And for an answer, I will turn to another review that Sickert wrote at about the same time, late 1889, early 1890, in which he addressed this issue head on. And here I am happy to say he has something nice to say about Frederick Leighton. So Sickert writes, "If we approach a picture, what must it reveal to us on closer examination? Not new facts, certainly, about the subject of the picture. The embroidery on the cloak of Philip IV does not, on examination, reveal its construction or texture, nor, on approaching the portrait of Lady Archibald Campbell, do we find the hairs of the fur cape evident. An examination of the surface of Sir Frederick Leighton's Summer Moon," and I'm sorry I don't have a lovely reproduction of this, so it's in a private collection, and this was the best I could do. Sickert, going on, so an examination of the surface of Sir Frederick Leighton's Summer Moon would reveal no new facts about the sleeping figures that could not be seen at the distance at which the picture is visible as a whole. What is it, then, that these works all yield in their different ways on nearer examination? It is nothing more than a subtle attribute which painters call quality, a certain beauty and fitness of expression in paint, apparently ragged, perhaps, and capricious, but revealing to the connoisseur a thoughtful analysis of the essentials in the production of the emotion induced by the complex phenomena of vision. Yes, I realize all of that is a little bit vague, and now that I've become an English professor, I will say that it doesn't help that Sickert goes on to compare what he's talking about to style in literature, as if we had any idea what that is. But I am interested in how his key terms, emotions aroused by what he describes as the ragged and the capricious, connote struggle, incompletion, something altogether not quite under the artist's control. These seem to be the qualities that, for Sickert, distinguish Leighton's painting from what would seem, especially with the kind of visual uniformity created by projected digital images this way, to be extremely similar kinds of pictures, similar subjects treated in similar ways by Alma-Tadema and by Leighton. But he found this je ne sais quoi of raggedness and capriciousness in Leighton's art. And the values that he's working from here, of course, led directly to Roger Fry and other modernists' ideas that the artist's struggle and his or her personality with that struggle should somehow be encoded in the handling of paint. So here I'm thinking about the way that Roger Fry, in his famous book on Cézanne of 1927, wrote about Cézanne. So this is a long quote. He seems hardly to arrive at the comprehension of his theme till the very end of his work. There is always something still lurking behind the expression, something he would grasp if he could. In short, he is not perfect. He never dares trust to his acquired knowledge. The construction behind each brushstroke has to be won from nature at every step, and he will do nothing except at the dictation of a conviction which arises in him as the result of contemplation. And Fry goes on, many modern painters have intense assurance. No one was less assured than Cézanne. And of course he means that as a compliment. This kind of production of hesitancy and lack of assurance is exactly what he admired. Here is Roger Fry writing at the same period about another artist. Quote, "The first quality of Vanessa Bell's painting is its extreme honesty," he says. That's the opening line of a review he published in 1922 that goes on to insist, quote, "In her case, this virtue shines with a special brightness because she has no trace of what would ordinarily be called cleverness in a painter." And he defines this cleverness as, quote, "the power to give an illusion of appearance by a brilliant shorthand turn of the brush," end quote. In short, what Fry admires is that Vanessa Bell's struggles are visible on the canvas. Instead of the cleverness of quick accomplishment, Fry says Bell, quote, "follows her own vision unhesitatingly and confidingly. If the result is not very legible, she never tries to make it out any more definite or more vividly descriptive than it is," end quote. And finally, he says, Bell, quote, "has entirely avoided a mistake which almost always besets English artists at some period of their career, namely the research for beautiful quality as an end in itself. She knows that handling and quality of paint are only really beautiful when they come unconsciously in the process of trying to express an idea," end quote. And he concludes that Bell's quote-unquote, rather detached portraits are, quote, "singularly alive and coherent in gesture of expression," and concludes that this portrait, the portrait of Mrs. M, is perhaps the most brilliant thing in the whole exhibition that he is reviewing. Now, I'm not going to pretend to evaluate these assessments, either Sickert's or Fry's, as truth claims. Is Vanessa Bell's style a paradigm of honest struggle? Is Leighton's handling more capricious than Alma-Tadema's? As Elizabeth Pretjohn has documented, critics other than Sickert at time complained also about Leighton's surfaces, their waxiness and over-smoothness. These claims are subjective, and we could chase them around forever, only to conclude that waxiness is in the eye of the beholder. Or soapiness, for that matter. But what I am interested in is the way that these modern or modernist viewers wanted this other quality wherever they found it. They wanted something other than finish, a quality that Sickert called ragged, indicative of making do, of struggling, of striving. As Roger Fry wrote in a letter to Vanessa Bell in 1924, here he's writing about something by Duncan Grant, "I always like best things done in an impossibly short time, without pretension, with incredible makeshifts, which always do so much better than the proper thing." And I think that's the key phrase. And then he goes on to say, "and Duncan has genius for that kind of invention." That's the end of the quote. This is what modernists wanted from artists, and therefore, of course, what they wanted from modernist houses. And that is certainly true that this is the appeal of Charleston, if it is appealing to you, which pioneered the aesthetic that would later be commercialized as shabby chic. When Bloomsbury Rooms came out in 2004, there was actually some talk of trying to market it as a kind of contemporary, you know, like how to decorate your home book. I had to put the kibosh on that because I said, you know, anybody who picks up the book wanting that will immediately put it back down again. But they really liked this phrase across the square at Yale University Press, this phrase shabby chic. They were very excited about. And of course, that shabby chic became a backdrop for celebrity shots. Here you see a suitably disheveled Nicole Kidman lounging around in her scanties at Charleston. And perhaps, more interestingly, the house became something of an obsession with the rock and roll singer. I hope people know who Patti Smith is, or I'm going to have to do my a cappella version of People Have the Power. So Patti Smith explains, talking about Charleston, quote, "When I came here a few years ago, I felt a real longing to document this place in the same manner that I document my own home, because it's very much how I live. Books everywhere, things that seem humble, very sacred, everything they did when you look at the house. Art wasn't a precious thing, art was part of everyday living." And people probably know that Patti Smith has been going around taking photographs. Her photographs of Charleston aestheticize the kind of makeshift beauty of this modernist artist's house in ways that emphasize the struggle to produce art, both thematically, so these kind of amazing pictures of the paint materials left in Duncan Grant's studio, and in the style of her photographs, which, although they're produced with a 1970s Polaroid land camera, are redolent of something older. Patti Smith says, if somebody asked me what kind of photographer I aspire to be, I would say a 19th century amateur. That's my goal. All right, she brings this perspective, of course, to the homes of writers, too. I'm showing you here Victor Hugo and Virginia Woolf's desks, and to their focusing on their spaces of work, as you see here, but also on these kinds of themes of intimate or personal experience, of sexuality, of the human limitations of sleep, on death, themes that come together. Those are my death slides, sorry. These themes that come together in her commentary on this image of Charleston, which I'll take a moment and read with you here. "In the farmhouse that belonged to the painter Vanessa Bell, in the mirror that belonged to her mother, yet is so old that the surface is pitted. It is said that her sister Virginia Woolf watched her mother die in this mirror. Virginia, as she was only 13, could not bear," and the new English professor in me has to notice that bear is spelled wrong, "could not bear to watch her mother die, so watched her reflection instead." So this, this is the kind of narrative that is produced in this form of aestheticization of the house at Charleston. And I'm using Patti Smith to stand in for what I take to be the kind of these modern desires around the idea of the artist's house or the author's house. There are many more examples. When Princeton English professor Diana Fuss wrote The Sense of an Interior, she was explicit that the book is about what she calls the unexplored link between the inner mind and the inner dwelling. She says that is the heart of the project. The book, in case you can't tell from the pictures, focuses on Helen Keller, Emily Dickinson, Sigmund Freud, and Marcel Proust, and has chapters on each of their house. In short, what modern visitors look for in artists' or authors' houses is what we might call interiority, interior spaces that are read psychologically as indices of an idea of creativity manifested through struggle, depth, raggedness, process. What Victorian artists' houses seem to offer, in contrast, is a fantasy of surfaces, an idea of creativity manifest in brilliance, accomplishment, and that magic Victorian term of approbation, finish. No wonder, then, that Walter Sickert, our pioneering modernist, in an essay of 1896, objected strenuously to the preservation of Leighton House. He argued that the artist, that this particular artist, quote unquote, lives in his work. And he cites especially the sketches from the nude model that Sickert says were expressions of emotion by means of poses of the human body. And he complains that Leighton often later obscured these by his drapery. What Sickert calls the gracious comedy of human passion, he says, that is evident in what he calls the nude stage of Leighton's sketches is, quote, sadly obscured by the swaddling of the next stage. The house, Sickert seems to imply, is like the draperies. And when he talks about the draperies, he says that their effect is either the archaeological or the indeterminate. The former, he complains, is no better than its sources. The latter is meaningless. And then he says about Leighton House, Leighton's house will become a white elephant. In 10 years, the tired piety will turn to foolishness and embarrassment. Do not let us consecrate in perpetuity the hotel now that the brilliant guest has gone. Do not let us prepare for ourselves the sneers of neo-Georgian generations at the taste in house decoration of a late Victorian president of the Royal Academy. So you can boo and hiss there too. And so clearly he was wrong, I'm just going to say that. Yeah. So, because of course both aesthetics, the late Victorian aesthetic and what Sickert foresaw as the neo-Georgian, reflect their era's ethical ideals. There's erudition and decorum on the one hand for the Victorians, and then individual authenticity expressed through struggle for the modernists. More specifically, these values could accurately be described as the ideology of their era's upper middle class. Charlotte Geer has taught us how the phenomenon of the artist's house grew out of the custom of the Sunday open houses when patrons could visit the studios of academicians to see what they were planning for their upcoming exhibitions. And she argues convincingly that this form of self-advertisement became the first middle-class aesthetic that challenged aristocratic tastes from below, which I think is very interesting and significant. All that erudite display of classical reference and historical illusion on the part of the Victorians, not to mention the shiny surfaces suggestive of scented soap as if to repel dirt, as surely as they masked any trace of labor, refute associations with the tradesman or the laborer, all of those things that were important to the Victorian upper middle classes to express. And certainly Alma-Tadema's, oh, sorry, that was my picture about shininess and surfaces. And certainly Alma-Tadema's many pictures proposing classical sanction for the admiration of the results of the artist's labors. Here you see a couple of examples focused on painting, a couple of examples focused on sculpture. So in all of them, we see people admiring the results of the artist's labor rather than the labor itself. And I think that also supports this analysis about this as an upper middle class aesthetic. In contrast, let me show you this version of the painter's studio, while I note that when modernists like Fry challenged Alma-Tadema's finesse in favor of more casual subject matter and this kind of excessively or obviously handmade facture, the argument was also about class. In that article by Roger Fry, the cranky one that I began with, he classifies Alma-Tadema as, quote, typical of the purely commercial ideas of the age in which he grew up, in which, however ill-constructed a saleable article might be, it had one particular saving grace, that of shop finish, the careful obliteration of all of those marks which are left on an object by the process of its manufacture, end quote. So that's the complaint, of course, from the modernist perspective about the finished Victorian painting. It is then no surprise that another document issued at the same period by Roger Fry describes the artists of the Omega workshops. This is quoting from their first catalog. He says that the artists involved in the workshops, quote, refuse to spoil the expressive quality of their work by sandpapering it down to a shop finish, in the belief that the public has at last seen through the humbug of the machine-made imitation of works of art. So this is the contrast. So it's just like in that famous example by Pierre Bourdieu about French culinary habits, where he talks about how peasant foods, artisanal peasant foods like quiche, become the sort of signs of the upper middle class at exactly the time when advances in manufacturing made refined wheat bread available to the masses. So similarly in art, the look of the handmade in the 20th century becomes the new sign of sophistication. Now that may sound cynical, but I actually don't mean it that way. Rather, by highlighting how each of the aesthetics I'm discussing and comparing here enacts the ideals of its era, what I'm intending to do is follow Liz Pretjohn's important and insightful defense of Leighton as a modernist, in which she challenged the muddling of aesthetic and moral criteria by critics both Victorian and modernist, and urged us, instead of foreclosing certain kinds of aesthetic experience as kind of morally and ethically wrong, to be open to the historical variety of these different kinds of aesthetics. In particular, Pretjon encourages us to move beyond the high modernist condemnation of Leighton's accomplished academic finish and to see his paintings instead as evidence of something that looks much more like struggle. She quotes one of Leighton's presidential addresses to the Royal Academy in which he admitted, quote, so this is Leighton speaking here, "We can never be like the ancients. We can no longer be the unconscious voice of our times. We are introspective, analytical. Doubts and self-consciousness beset and hamper us," end quote. And then Liz offers readings of his art that register these anxieties, including in the famous Daedalus and Icarus, in which she explores as a rumination on the sculptor/father/artist's looming failure. Turning to Leighton House, another scholar, Jason Edwards, finds similar iconographies of struggle, which he interprets as a form of psychological interiority. The pastoralism that is clear to everybody at Leighton's house, he argues, is, quote, deliberately partial or self-consciously unsuccessful, end quote. And then rather than evoking the beneficence of nature, he argues, Leighton alludes to the idea of survival of the fittest, both in the natural world and in the competitive Victorian economy that Leighton competed within. Jason Edwards goes on to read the, quote, elaborately decorated, colored, textured, tiled, mosaic surfaces of Leighton House as the artist's way to urge, quote unquote, visitors to resist a hermeneutics of death. So all that depth. So all that shininess is supposed to keep us from going inside. But then he challenges that defensiveness. He challenges what he sees as Leighton's shininess by going inside, by looking for forms of psychological interiority in the iconography of snakes here, for example, in this mosaic design, and of course in the famous athlete wrestling a python, which was displayed in the studio at Leighton House in 1877. So Jason Edwards encourages us today to, quote unquote, imagine an artist whose relation to eroticism was guilty and self-consciously post-lapsarian, end quote. Ultimately, Edwards understands Leighton House with its many nooks and crannies, its built-in compartments and pigeonholes, its balustrades, its curtains, its screens. First, he describes it as, quote unquote, an elaborate architectural closet, end quote, but then circling back self-correctively in the same essay, he describes it instead as something, quote unquote, flirtatious, articulating a pleasurably rather than defensively, self-consciously rather than symptomatically encrypted environment. So this idea of a kind of code that invites us to decode it. Returning to the idea of the house's shiny surfaces, Edwards asks us ultimately to conceive them not as deflectors of a penetrating gaze, but as invitations for what he describes as hands, feet, and skin more generally, that's the end of the quote, to feel, to touch. And I found this picture on the internet, much to my desire, that documents the desire to, or much to my happiness, it documents the desire to touch, as you can see here, and by the necessity of the sign telling us not to. So that in Jason Edwards' arguments, this idea of a kind of sensual, all-over sort of corporeality to one's experience at Leighton House extends to the sounds, to the splashing fountain, and to the imitations of appetite in the animals and fruits that are depicted in the decor, and become an endorsement for Walter Pater's invocations to indulge in sensual and bodily pleasure. Now, I will say, particularly since he's not here, I can be a little bit critical. Although I really, really like that article, I worry a bit about the repetition of the word self-conscious in it. Remember that he says that Leighton's pastoralism is self-consciously unsuccessful. He describes him as self-consciously post-lapsarian, and he says that the house is rather than self-consciously rather than symptomatically an encrypted environment. So we get this kind of compulsive insistence on the term self-conscious, which is a kind of argument for intent. And, I do worry about the intentional fallacy. And therefore, I also balk at Edwards' conclusion that, quote, Leighton deliberately designed his house with precisely this notion of the sexual secret in mind, end quote. Because I don't think it's necessary or desirable to impute conscious intent, self-consciously that term self-consciously or deliberately designed, that kind of thing. It's not necessary to impute that sort of self-conscious intention to the effects that we decide to experience at Leighton House. Effects that parallel in an interesting way, I think, Jang-Woo Kim's recent readings of Leighton's process in Kim's book, Painted Men in Britain, where he talks about the repression of male intimacy as we move from preparatory sketch to final painting in Leighton's work. Again, it's not, Kim doesn't make this an argument for conscious intention. It's rather a reading of the work that makes sense to us today if what we want is signs of internal struggle, psychological, and sort of a kind of psychological interiority when we look at works of art. So, to conclude, and I thought I'd put in this picture of Leighton because it shows both and the sea gave up the dead and the python and athlete picture here. So, you know, if there is a picture of Leighton's exteriorized psychology, it would be this picture. So what do we want from artists' houses? The question that I set myself to answer as an opening for the conversations today. The answer, of course, is that depends on who we is. At this point, I would hope that we have enough critical distance on both the Victorians and the modernists to allow for an appreciation of the ideals that I would argue are more complementary than actually mutually exclusive or conflicting. After all, these are the ideals that we have inherited as people in the 21st century coming out of this 19th and 20th century history of the development of the middle class. These are our norms, these are our ideals, these are the issues that we live between in our daily lives, right? Aspirations to kind of polished accomplishment and perfect finish and you know, being all erudite and getting everything right on the one hand, the inevitable acknowledgement of struggle and failure and psychological interiority on the other hand. So I would hope that we would be able to see these spaces in both terms and to discover forms of pleasure in both of those kinds of ideas and to be able to hold them simultaneously in our minds without feeling like we need to choose one and condemn the other. We want artists' houses to be places where the surfaces invite us to perceive depth, to see qualities of raggedness, capriciousness, honesty, to take just a few of the terms from the modernist critics that I quoted, as evidence of the creative processes that we can imagine ourselves into. And this may not have been what the Victorians wanted, but when I was thinking about this, I really came to wonder about that, because I think it's very much worth considering how much upper middle class Victorian audiences who were really trained in how difficult it is to create a finished surface. You know, so for men, of course, professions, you know, from botany to architecture, all involved a lot of kind of training in drawing. For women, all those ladylike accomplishments of watercolor and needlework and that kind of thing also involved an enormous amount of training in how to actually create illusionistic surfaces. So I wonder if for Victorian audiences, they were able to read a kind of labor into that idea of the finished, highly polished surface, that in our era, where every single one of my students thinks he or she is a fantastic photographer because with the iPhone they all look good. You know, that there would have been a much greater sense of the struggle behind the surface for Victorian audiences, and those Victorian audiences might therefore have been sensitive to those ideas of process or raggedness or capriciousness in what looks very licked or finished to us. But in any case, I think I think that's what we want, some sort of ability to integrate these two ideals, and I would therefore welcome the kind of readings of artworks like I've just been quoting from Liz Pretchen and Jason Edwards, and readings of artworks in artists' houses that enact us, enable us to enact these forms of imaginative interpretation, creative response, because these are what makes these sites of pastness relevant in our present. So I expect we will hear a great deal about these houses today, a good deal of that kind of work of imagining ourselves into these spaces, and I look forward to tomorrow as well, when we will trace the impact of Alma-Tadema's art on what may be the ultimate seductive surface of the 20th and 21st century, you know, the movie screen. So without further ado, I'll get out of the way away and allow this rich sequence of offerings to begin. Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that talk. And if you said it was a nice introduction, it was certainly a very nice lecture. Thank you very much for all your comments. And I think Tadema would thank you as well. Now, I'm seeing a hand right away. Charles.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that excellent talk. But it isn't really true that Tadema always suppresses signs of work. There's Phidias holding a chisel, showing Pericles and his friends, the Parthenon frieze in progress as the sculptor's model. There's the workman working on the head of a sculpture. There's the architect with his tools of his trade. So it's not really true what you said about that.
Well, I think that goes with this idea that even though the surfaces of the pictures don't show to us the kind of facture that modernists look like, that there is a kind of registration of how the things would have been made. So yes, you're right. He shows in these very finished pictures depictions of certainly of people working. In addition to the kinds of pictures that celebrate the sort of admiration for the finished project. Yes, that's definitely there as well.
Morning, yeah.
I was really interested, Chris. Well, first of all, I should say thank you. I was very interested in your discussion citing Charlotte Gear about the idea of the middle class sort of aesthetic from the bottom rising up. And that brought to mind Fry's discussion in the essay Art and Socialism about the differences between 18th century art and 19th century art. And I was wondering if that is something we could bring to bear here. In other words, that 18th century art is superior because it's about a kind of affiliation between artist and aristocratic patron, whereas 19th century art is a plutocratic art.
Yes. All right. Will I or won't I? I'm taking the slide out and putting it back in, taking the slide out and putting it back in. So I finally just put it at the end of the presentation. So there's a very, very small Does anybody know what it is? Yeah, so this is where the Trumps live. And I mean, so there is clearly a way in which this kind of, let's just go with excessive shininess, does still register, I think, as the image of the plutocrat in a way that's troublesome. Because if we are going to reintroduce moral and ethical kinds of considerations into our aesthetics, I think this is an extreme case that makes it, allows us to do that. But certainly for Fry, despite all of the claims of formalism to be beyond that, it's constantly there in his language. Is about the kind of social aspirations and social values and ethical values that he saw associated with modernism. So, does that really answer to your question? I hope so. But what I hope I'm saying is that, he had to see it that way. He had to see the 19th century plutocratic shininess as the thing that he was working against to create a sort of better world for a 20th century kind of handmade facture. But of course, that's a fantasy too, that somehow the 18th century was, the integration of artist and patron was somehow more like the 20th century that he wanted. The 19th century just becomes a kind of whipping boy for what he wanted to get away from.
Yeah, Anna.
Thanks for that, Chris. It was fantastic, and thanks for mentioning Sickert.
Well, it was all Anna's idea.
Well, no, it wasn't. It wasn't my idea at all. But I did mention Sickert to you, and
you must tell them about Sickert.
I wanted to make reference to another comment of Sickert's about Alma-Tadema, which is the one again written in the 1880s, where he says that Alma-Tadema's pictures will tell people what people who lived in St. John's Wood lived, the way in which people in St John's Wood lived, and Whistler's pictures of shop fronts would tell people how Londoners really lived in the 19th century. And of course, underlying that, it's not a question of surface there, it's a question of a social conscience. And he's contrasting the image of the very rich, living in St John's Wood, with the very poor, who shopped in the shops that you see in Whistler's shops, paintings of shop fronts. So, I mean, I think actually that interest that Fry has is actually something that is shared with Sickert, and is not often mentioned when looking at Sickert's writing on art.
I think that's very interesting there, but we have to be very careful about the precise social levels we're talking about here. Shaw does a brilliant demolition job on Fry's article by demonstrating exactly what sort of social level, and with the character of Miss Ponsonby de Tompkins, as I remember. And I mean, you know, the people of St John's Wood are also of a particular, and they're not the very wealthy. They're the that's where I think, you know, the assimilating Trump Tower to our notions of a Victorian commercial class. I mean, we have to be quite careful about exactly what social level we're talking about. That's what
yes, but within the context of the 1880s, people would have known who lived in St John's Wood, and I don't think Sickert is in fact he's not referring to aristocrats in that comment. He's referring to the people who live in the nouveau riche, who are building these magnificent houses and filling them with glittery objects. So it is a comment on you know, the level of wealth in London and the differences in that level.
Chris?
It's certainly a matter of subject matter, as you suggest, but I think it's also a matter of finish, and it is a matter of this kind of glitteriness as opposed to a different kind of finish that, you know, that famously Whistler demonstrated, and that Sickert admired. And I do think that's interesting, the way that you know, this sort of finish versus factor plays out, and in exactly the way that you talked about, with these kind of ethical implications that people apply to a visual aesthetic.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, that is the central concern of the late 19th century in England, I think. I mean, that's how I would define a new modernist voice, which is emerging at that moment. But I thought I'd wave a flag for Sickert's socialism.
It's really interesting how these things recur. The soap thing, of course, George Moore uses that about Leighton in 1895. So that the scented soap joke has been around for a long time as well.
Yes, and we forget that they were Fry's first mentors. Sickert, George Moore, that was the circle he moved in.
Nick?
Chris, can I ask you a kind of curatorial question from sort of my personal angle, which is that when you visit some of the places you've shown, like Charleston, like Leighton House, perhaps Kettle's Yard, are you aware, to go back to your title, of there being any kind of mismatch between what you feel the curators or the public are perceived to want from those spaces now and what perhaps the original inhabitants wanted?
Sure, but even what the original inhabitants wanted is sort of a moving target. I mean, it's always an issue of what period you restore a house to. And, I mean, in some ways I feel like the desire for that match is that modernist desire to somehow get into the interiority of a famous person who lived there, which is, you know, which is always going to be a kind of fiction. You know, when I went to Monk's house a million years ago for the first time, I was in line, you know, so there's these nice ladies from the National Trust taking your money and everything. There was an American family in front of me, and, you know, mom and dad paid, and a sort of surly teenager, she tried to engage him in conversation, and she said, well, do you have any questions about the house? And he looked at her and he said, where's the river? And yes, he said. And I thought, well, that's not where she wanted that to go, but you know, he had sort of fixated on some place between what his mother was getting out of this and what the guides wanted you to get out of this, and went right for the trouble spot. And so, you know, I mean, I think, of course, it's a
Chris, thank you very much. I wanted to just take that comment about artist houses and that experience of the contemporary just one step further to say, what then, why do we do it? What is it that we think that the visitor is going to get from that almost visceral experience of walking into Charleston or walking into Watts or walking into, I don't know, Carl Larsen's house, and which will give them something which they couldn't have got having seen that work, a work by that artist on the wall, or indeed read a book by the writer because they're walking into, you know, Victor Hugo's house.
Well,
What
again,
is the connection?
Yeah, well, it depends on who we think the viewers are. But, and I mean, to some extent, simply getting people on site is a way of creating a kind of focus on a particular artist or author's work and having a kind of extended period in which to think about that particular person. And I guess I would not say that we want a particular outcome, but we want people to make the most of that period of focus for them. I mean, I am that annoying American professor who brings groups of American students over and clutters up your historic home. I do have rules. I tell them that they can't wear flip-flops, they can't wear anything that they would wear to bed, and they can't wear anything with the name of their university or any other American university. So I do kind of have mine blend a little bit with other people. But particularly when you take groups of students, it's interesting to see how different students take completely different things away. And this summer we was doing a class where we went to some poets' houses, and these kids would get very sort of excited about reading their own poetry in the gardens of these famous poets' houses. I mean, on one level, it's so obviously kind of self-involved that it becomes endearing. Because what they're trying to do is understand themselves as poets, as creative people. And, it's not really about understanding Keats or Yeats or somebody, but it's about understanding themselves as people who are coming into some sort of creative maturity, we hope. And so for that constituency, that's what I think it's wonderful if they get that. For other constituencies, it's probably important to have something that's more historically grounded. But we want a variety of experiences to happen.
Thank you for that wonderful lecture.
I really feel I should make this go away.
Oh, well, I think the Trump thing is rather instructive. I think it's good to have. And I mean, the artist's house. So coming to Alma-Tadema's work in this wonderful exhibition, to start thinking about interiority is how I started to think, because to me, and especially the idea of an artist's house is how to get inside the artist's mind. I would have thought the great draw card is I'm going to understand how this process, which is such a modern concern, works, how creativity comes about. And maybe that's where these Victorian artists are inviting people into process and leading to the modern. But it seems to me Alma-Tadema, with his extraordinary registrations of light and control of the various kinds of light, which aren't just shiny light, it's daylight versus artificial light versus reflected light. It's the most subtle, and it's all that soapy marble glowing light. Extraordinary contrast of light and of focus, of things that are suddenly near to you and then very distant. And then of space. And that's the one that I find such a draw card that to me, although people aren't, addressing you with their hardship stories, their struggle as an artist, it's like you're inside the artist's mind, because the space keeps receding, there's memory is invoked and so on. So my question is really, have you found anyone contemporary or thereabouts saying that what it's like to walk into one of these spaces that Alma-Tadema creates, that says that is like walking into an interior, the whole idea you articulated so marvellously. We might have that with Emily Dickinson, but that's, to me, it's not surface. It's not an obvious. All right, it's the attributes of antiquity, but it's so peculiar and particular. It's so recognisably Alma-Tadema's mind that we're walking into. So, was there anyone who saw that? Or does it take
turn that question over to the experts in the room?
So are you talking about when people walked into the Tadema houses, or about Tadema's paintings?
The house,
Or
any of those great paintings. To me, it opens up a world, but it's a world that's somehow like a cosmic world. It's so complex and layered and takes you around corners and has light from this angle, light from that angle. I'm sort of going to do that.
so yes, okay, great. Good. So that sounds like a very good place. I'm very glad you've raised the question of the spaces and the spatial experiences in both the pictures and the houses, which is the thing we were trying to draw together in the exhibition. And we will be carrying on. I notice it's gone 10:25, so it's time for a coffee. And just to thank Chris once more for a brilliant talk.
So I think coffee's been